Hi, I'm
Hello,
Josh,
friends. And I'm AJ.
and this
It's
is your
Conversation
podcast.
Quests.
Yeah, your podcast for everything. Conversation Quest. It's been a minute. It's been a weird 3 weeks.
Yes, it has.
So last week we discussed, our last podcast, we discussed Russia invading Ukraine and some of the implications that has for those of us who aren't in Russia or Ukraine. Um, and that has become a smaller world. Um, AJ is going to take most of the run on this one because I've been doing research, uh, trying to just get words from people I know, words from people people I know. Uh, so I don't have any hard documents to pull up. I just have sentiments and on boots on ground reporting. So what I say, take with a grain of salt because it's not directly from me or from a confirmed source. It is from my people who are dealing with this stuff as it's happening. AJ, take it away.
Yeah, I mean, like we mentioned last time, in the last podcast on this subject, this is all relatively new to most people, and neither you nor I live in those areas, nor have ever lived in those areas. And it's war we're talking about, right? So whatever the war is, whether it's Iraq and Afghanistan or um, Russia and Ukraine, the data coming out is going to be flooded with propaganda. It's going to be flooded with inaccuracies. And even people who do this stuff for a living are going to be wrong just because everything's happening live and it's all relatively new, right? So we touched a little bit last time on the fact that for most people, this is probably going to seem like completely random action by Putin, right? He just woke up one day on the wrong side of the bed and ran into Ukraine. And you mentioned a little bit last time that there's a much longer history of this, right? The probably some of the most relevant things would be the 2014 coup uh, in the Maidan region, the uh, the burning of some civilians or protesters alive in a building in that Odessa area. So all that was in about 2014 or so, 2015. And since then, um, basically there's been nonstop fighting on the east side of Ukraine, which is the area that's often referred to as the Donbass region. And it's right up against Russia's border, right? So I pulled up a map last time. I'm trying to find a similar one that I have open. Um, so here's a map.
Mhm.
Okay, that's a good size. So you can see here's the border, right? This is the Ukraine-Russia border, and you can see the Luhansk and Donetsk area. This is the area, as far as I understand it, that is referred to as the Donbass region. So a lot of the people that live in the Donbass region are, while this technically belongs to Ukraine, the territory does. They are ethnic. A lot of them are ethnic Russians. They speak Russian as their mother tongue or their first language, and they are a lot of them are Ukrainian separatists. They consider themselves Russians. They just happen to live in Ukraine. So my understanding of some of the stuff that was going on in the 2014 coup was that it was a U.S. backed coup to replace the government at the time with a more favorable to the U.S. government. In fact, there's been tape that came out of Victoria Nuland saying basically that we have to pick Yanukovych's replacement, and we being the U.S. She's on tape saying "fuck NATO." I think I had a link to that. I don't have it in front of me. But basically, her argument was, we're choosing the government. It doesn't matter who anybody else wants, right? Part of the government that was put into place there, I had mentioned towards the end of the podcast last time that I heard a little bit about the idea that there were some potential neo-Nazis within the Ukrainian government. And I'd said just before we got off stream last time that, words like Nazi or whatever you want to use as a sort of a slur or a political slur, essentially against your opponent. Nazi is one of the most popular, right? You're a Nazi, you're a racist, whatever, and it's a way to automatically put you on defense. So at the time, I didn't know anything about whether or not there were or there were not any potential reason to think that there were Nazis within the government. So since then, I've done some research. I watched Oliver Stone's documentary called Ukraine on Fire. Have you seen that?
Not yet, no.
Pretty interesting. My understanding is actually it got pulled off of YouTube recently.
Okay.
I think it was YouTube. So you're gonna have to find it some other way. But that was really interesting. It covers the 2014 coup. It covers the all the parties involved on the US's side, all the parties involved in that particular area. And in that documentary, plus some other podcasts and things like that I've listened to on the subject, they mention these people. So it does appear that there are neo-Nazis within a certain branch of the Ukrainian government. Specifically, the Azov Battalion is what they're known as. There's also some people, the way I understand it, who identify as part of, what do they call it? It's not the radical right, but it's like the... Gosh, I have it here, but I have so many notes in front of me. Anyway, it's like an extreme right-wing group in that area. I forget what they call themselves, but it's separate from or quasi-linked to the Azov Battalion. And in that documentary, they go over the Azov Battalion specifically and how they are basically a branch of people who come from a long line of right-wing fascists and even like original Nazis from the world wars we all know about. Now they're, if you're a Nazi in today's time, you're typically referred to as a neo-Nazi. And they were part of, here it is. Actually, I have something here that says the OSS. So, Josh, you probably know the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. They reported in September of 1945 that Stefan Bandera earned a fierce reputation for conducting a, quote, reign of terror in World War II. And Stefan Bandera is probably a name, if you look into any of this Ukraine-Russia stuff, that you're going to hear pretty often, specifically because he is part of the really aggressive right-wing fascists and neo-Nazis in that particular part of the government, in that particular part of the world.
Yep.
So the and the history between Nazis and Russia goes back to the World Wars, if not before that, because if I remember correctly, Russia lost north of 20 million people fighting the Nazis.
It was a mess on both sides. Yeah.
So there's a lot of context that goes into this, right? All the way back to the 40s, the 50s. But more recently, my understanding is it would be more like the 2014, 2013, 2014, 2010, about that area. Stefan Bandera has long called for a, quote, pure race in Ukraine, which is exactly what Hitler called for. Um,
Now, one thing that I want to address at this point, which this seems like a very key point to discuss, is while
sure,
Ukraine is largely a very progressive country, like the further west you go, the more European it's going to be, the more progressive it's going to feel.
sure.
But there are a lot of people who are like, oh, well, who would want to return to Russia? Who would want to be under that? Why do they have these separatists? It's going to all be old conservative people. Conservative, for the most part, yes. Older, not really. Because remember, it was 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed.
Yeah.
And Russia was the keystone of the Soviet Union. Like when a lot of people put those two terms together, that's how close it was related. Russia was the Soviet Union.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
were all these other micronations around it. So anyone who had good times in their childhood and lived in that area and now aren't, they're going to be the ones going, hey, man, maybe we should be back at Russia. And we see
Sure.
that happen here in the States too. Like, that's kind of the whole purpose of, conservatism on a social level. Like, social conservatism is
Mhm.
most people remember the good old days, but it was only good for certain people.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
when you're in Russia, that's the conservative group. That is the, the modern conservative group. That is the people who are in power that were doing everything they could to stay in power. Oh, sorry. Continue.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's all really important context. And this is pertains, like you mentioned, not just to the U.S. but also to basically anywhere you can think of where you'll hear that there are bad people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether there's gangs or there's some corrupt part of the government or whatever. I forget the guy's name, but there's a, a Mexican guy that worked with the police in Mexico and on the border of the U.S. and worked with the citizens and fought against the Mexican drug cartels. That was on the Joe Rogan podcast forever ago. But he went deep into his experience with that area and how there was a time when specific parts of the Mexican government were so corrupt and so aggressive towards the citizens that actually the drug cartels became very popular and very positive forces to certain areas of the citizenry, specifically because they were fighting against the overbearing government as it was seen in that area. And that happens all over the place, right? So it's never easy to just say like these people are the only bad people. These are the
Yeah.
only people doing anything questionable. So there were back to what I was saying about the context of some of this going back to the 40s. Some Ukrainian Nazis were protected by the CIA during the Nuremberg trials in 45 and 46. I forget who it was, but somebody in prominence, like a prominent political person, said that if the Nuremberg trials happened today, some of those people, or happened at a different time, some of those people would have been would have been hanged then or killed then,
Yeah.
for crimes they committed that they got away with back then. So this goes quite a bit back. As Josh mentioned, 91, the USSR fell, and at that point, Ukraine was essentially free from the USSR, as many of the other areas were to some degree, right?
Now,
Um,
and
so
putting that into perspective, I was born in '86, so which means in
yeah,
1991 I was 5. I have formative memories of around 91. So when you think of older people being the ones that are like, oh, I want to go back to Russia, no, no, no. We're thinking people in their late 30s and 40s, some in the mid 30s who are seeing or hearing the stories of how great things used to be just a few years ago. And now they're seeing, a much bleaker future. So it's
yeah,
very recent too.
yeah, for sure. I mean, I was born in '88. My sister was born in '91. So I'm a little bit younger than Josh, so I don't have quite as many memories of that time, right? But I mean, that's people. That's both of your hosts right now,
Yeah.
uh, who were born around that area or around that era.
Who were born before the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah,
Let's put
which
that in
sounds absurd.
perspective.
It
Uh,
sounds absurd.
yeah.
So, some other ties to it's called the Right Sector. That's the group I was referring to earlier. Um,
And
Dmitry Yara.
it's worth
Go ahead.
stating, politically, I lean extremely left. Extremely. Um,
I'm
and I believe AJ is relatively left leaning as well. Um,
Yeah, I'm pretty. These terms kind of get battered around with not much understanding of sort of the context of the Overton window and the specific time
yeah,
and countries we're talking about. So,
but
for Americans, yeah,
yes.
I'm pretty liberal, pretty far left.
Um, and people, the connotation, especially with what Putin is trying to say, is that there are Nazis, and Nazis are conservative, and communism is a liberal leftist thing. But his particular flavor of communism is anything but. It is fighting a conservative notion with a conservative notion. Um, and so he's appealing to Western ideology of, oh, Nazis are bad. Yes, they're terrible. But what he's offering is realistically no better.
So he was born in '52, right? So, um, he's also in from Russia, right, or
Mhm.
from that area. So, what he would consider right wing or fascist or liberal or whatever is probably contextually a little different
Yes.
than what we would here in the States or even in Canada, um, or other areas in the Western world. So that's definitely important to consider.
Mhm.
Um, but there are also I forget the guy's name. I saved the video, but probably have it here somewhere.
And I mean,
There's
most specifically in social aspects, social conservatism, and you see regressionist attitudes on both fronts, such
Yeah,
as traditional family values uh, being espoused, like anti-gays. They are completely against the LGBT community on both sides. Um, and given the opportunity, Putin has, in fact, put people down for being gay in a more final sense than just with words.
yeah. The guy that I was actually just about to bring up, whose name I'm trying to either remember or pull up here in my notes. But he is a member of the Azov Battalion, um, and he is on tape bragging about how, as a a matter of numbers, the Azov Battalion itself within the Ukrainian government, I believe it's officially part of their National Guard. They don't have a lot of people in their battalion, but this guy was bragging about the power that they wield within the government, and in doing so, he actually stated at one point that without the Azov Battalion, who he claimed loves to murder and kill, and that's why the U.S. government, according to him, wanted to put them in power in that area. Without them, without the Azov Battalion and um, the ultra nationalists and Nazis within that group and their associated groups, that the protests in that part of the world back in 2014 would have become, quote, a gay parade. So, yeah, Josh is absolutely right. There's people on both sides, for sure, who are explicitly calling for the death of gays, as an example.
And minorities in general.
Yeah. He just happened to use gay at that particular time.
Yeah.
But sure, yeah, they're no fans of anybody that isn't part of the pure race, right? So that includes Jews, that includes anybody, blacks, anybody. One point that's brought up sometimes in the like typical, corporate media, or what you could call the mainstream media, CNN, MSNBC, stuff like that, is Zelensky, who's the president of Ukraine, is Jewish. So how can there be any Nazis close to the Ukrainian government? And apparently, go ahead.
The same way that we had a black president, but we still had racists in office. It's a
Sure,
a democratically elected government.
sure, and even within your own household or your own friend group, you obviously have people who disagree wildly on topics. That doesn't change just because it's in the government or in the military or whatever. Like it would be absurd to think that there's no racist people in our military or their military, that there's no, whatever bad thing you can think of. There's going to be people who subscribe to those theories within basically every group.
Absolutely.
But this is why I'm giving some of these examples with some of these people's names and some of the sources, because like I said at the time of the last podcast, I wasn't sure what any of that meant. Like, are there actual Nazis in there, or is this again just another example of somebody not agreeing with you and calling you a Nazi, which has happened personally to me, even within the last like decade, 8 years, something like that, by somebody who never met me. I don't remember if we talked about it on the podcast, but it was specifically because I asked a question to somebody else, but it was in a public manner, and this random person came on and accused me of being a Nazi and all kinds of other stuff. So anytime you can figure out any sort of context and any sort of specifics, that definitely helps to paint a clearer picture.
Yeah, and it's worth putting to an understanding why people use Nazi as the catch-all, because most people who aren't, that is the epitome of bad.
Yeah.
That is the epitome of fall in line, be exactly like us, say nothing about it, or else.
Yep. Yeah, it's exactly what it is. It's the easiest way to put you on defensive, to make you understand that in their minds, you are the worst, right? You are the worst thing most people are going to think of, and there's no reason to offer you any sort of redemption. And then because it puts you in the defensive, it's like, let's say we're in a group of 20 people, right? And somebody, whether they know you or they don't know you, says, you know what, you're a Nazi. That's going to get everybody's attention real quick, right? And then it's up to you to be like, well, no, I'm not a Nazi, and here's why I'm not a Nazi.
Yeah.
But that person already did damage. They already did damage, and in their minds, and people who think like that, people who would use that with no real evidence,
Yeah.
there's nothing you can say to convince them.
But in this case, we're talking about actual living, breathing, practicing Nazis.
Oh yeah. Like I said, I highly recommend that documentary.
But also,
Again, it's called
like
Ukraine
you
on
said,
Fire.
it's a small, very small group of people.
Right. Yeah. By no means am I saying that the entire Ukrainian government is like that or anything like that. And like we mentioned several times in the last podcast, we're specifically speaking about the governments, not the people. For anybody who didn't see the last one, my wife's father is straight from Ukraine. Fortunately, he's no longer living. He died when she was 3, but obviously, I never got to meet him. And she has some memories of him, but not very strong ones because she was only 3. And unfortunately, her mother died about 10 years ago, and she doesn't have much contact with any family from her father's side. So I don't even know. Like, her father could be from this exact area, and he could be an ethnic Russian who happened to live in Ukraine. I have no idea.
Yeah.
So in 2012, and I'm probably butchering all these names, I apologize, but doing the best I can. In 2012, Yanukovych or Yankokovich, something like that, Yanukovych, was the president of Ukraine. He fulfilled a campaign promise by signing into law Russian as the second national language of Ukraine, of the Ukrainian areas with predominantly Russian people. And that would be areas like we're talking about, Lugansk and Donetsk on the eastern side of Ukraine, right up against the Russian border. The very day after the new government, the one after Yanukovych, they tried to overturn that ruling, and it was overruled, which immediately started tension, right? And then the Maidan protests, you're going to hear a lot about if you guys try to look into any of this. That was in 2014. The anti-Maidan protests started in Odessa. So that's an area you're also going to hear a lot about, which is a very important port city in that area. Odessa is Ukraine's largest seaport, and protesters set up camp in front of the trade union house on May 2nd, 2014. Soccer fans showed up in Odessa for the Ukrainian soccer match. Many of them also turned out to be fighters from the Maidan self-defense units, along with radical members from all around the area. Many of them showed up masked and armed and became increasingly violent and destructive. They eventually marched on the anti-Maidan camp there. And up until that point, those protesters were largely just protesting in a nonviolent way. They chased these people into the building, the trade union building, and they set the building on fire and burned those people alive. So that is context involving these two specific groups that you're going to hear a lot about if you look into anything other than, the typical news outlets, Fox News, CNN, MSNBC. They're probably not going to mention any of this stuff. But this is all documented in that documentary. You can read about it online.
So there's also been some updates. Some news has come out past few days that has kind of changed how things are perceived. Russia had a policy stating that conscripts, the people who have to do their national service, the military, can't go to war. They can't be sent to war. But Russia's spokesperson has said that yes, they are there. On the front line. Some of the soldiers have been getting told that they will be fired for their poor performance in the Ukraine. Some people who were Russian soldiers that got captured were found to have their rations having expired in 2015.
And this is on which side?
Russian soldiers, both sides,
That were
like
captured. Okay.
yeah, captured Russian soldier. They kind of were like going through his stuff, and his MREs expired in 2015. So even though they can still last a while, depending on how they're stored, taking your chances.
Yeah, 7-8 years ago.
Russian armor. Some of their lighter tanks, some of their their armored vehicles, getting towed away by farmers in Ukraine. They're breaking down. They're not being serviced. No fuel. We heard last time we spoke. There was Snake Island in Ukraine. There were 13 guys on the island, and when the Russian warship told them to surrender, they responded, "Go fuck yourself, Russian warship." And they were reported dead. However, they are now believed to be alive and well.
Yeah.
So that's good news. On the flip side, reports are coming in, and some of my people on the ground have suggested they've heard this more directly than just through news. 3 Russian generals reportedly killed in Ukraine in less than 2 weeks. And then Ukrainian military tweeted it out Friday that Major General Andrei Kolesnikov has been killed. He was reportedly the commander of the 29th Combined Arms Army. That is on the heels of both Andrei Sukhovsky and who's the other? Vitaly Gerasimov. Because Russia is sending their generals to lead from the front. Also, and this one, AJ and I were talking about right before. We were trying to remember if I had discussed this. Belarus is allied with Russia. They have a dictator who has been in power longer than any other current dictator on the planet. Alexander Lukashenko. He's their president. He showed a Russian battle plan on live TV to bolster support for his citizens. And on this map, and in his discussion, Russia was going to go down through Ukraine, take Odessa, the port city, and then just kind of surf over to Moldova. Another former Soviet territory. And this had some implications for other former Soviet nations. There are some big talks in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia about possibly adjusting their firearms laws to allow civilians to better prepare, the same way Ukraine has been doing. So that's kind of the the TLDR bullet points of the up to date, like the implications for that.
Yeah, those are some of the definitely some of the more recent war related parts of it, right?
Yeah.
Um, that that Snake Island story. I don't actually remember if we talked about last time, but yeah, at that time that we did the podcast, um, it was reported that those soldiers, were killed. It was later reported, and still seems to be the up to date report, as far as I know, that they were not killed, that they were captured, that they were alive. Last I heard, and there's no real way to know whether that was, I guess, misinformation or disinformation, right? Whether that was stories like that are meant to be propaganda or not. There's Have you seen the videos of the Russian soldiers in Ukraine who they look relatively young, like 18, 19, and there's one specifically of a guy um, who's eating like tea and a biscuit, and there's a woman next to him who uses her phone to call his mother. Have you seen that?
I haven't seen that specific one, but that's been a thing that's been going on. Is um, captured Russians are being given the opportunity to call home.
Yeah. So the first time I saw that, right, I saw that one that I specifically mentioned, and then there was another one of a Russian soldier in an office, and his hands are handcuffed. Um, and both of those soldiers start crying when their mothers come on the phone. Um, when I first saw that, I cried a little, because like these people are humans, right?
Yeah,
Even Putin's a human. Um,
shitty one, but yes.
um, so it is it is difficult to see some of this. There's footage of all kinds of like there was footage of a hospital, um, and there were kids in all different shapes of bad. Um, and it's hard, man. Like I'll do some research and then I gotta stop because it just gets too depressing. But also because it's so close to like when it's actually happening. It's really hard to tell what's real and what's not. Um, so definitely consider that when you guys are listening to this kind of stuff, whether it's from us or anybody else. Um, but we're definitely doing our best here to make sense of it all. Some more what I would describe as silly um, updates. Did you hear about the Federation Internationale Feline and their
No.
new policy? So the Federation Internationale Feline announced two new policies. First, quote, no cat bred in Russia may be imported and registered in any FIFE pedigree book outside of Russia, regardless of which organization issued its pedigree.
Okay.
Second, quote, no cat belonging to exhibitors living in Russia may be entered in an FIFE show outside of Russia, regardless of which organization these exhibitors hold their membership in. So, this is one example of people trying to cause pressure towards Russians or the Russian government, right?
Yeah.
I have a Russian blue cat. And whether I had one or not, I'm not really sure what benefit this offers to, or what harm this is supposed to do to Putin, or whoever they think they're harming. Um, Nintendo delayed the release of one of their games. It's a remake of Advance Wars 1 and 2. They delayed it indefinitely, and specifically mention the reason as the Ukraine-Russia conflict because it's a war game. Um, it is a cartoony war game. Um,
Yeah.
as far as I know, it's not specifically like Russian and Ukrainian soldiers only or anything like that. Um, a lot of this stuff I think gets like a lot of it probably comes
Good
uh,
place.
from a good place. Like they don't want to be associated with anything that they see as negative, right?
Hmm.
And that's fair enough. But realistically, what a lot of these things are going to do, and a lot of people in our government are talking about sanctions. Um, what a lot of these end up doing is hurting the actual citizens of these places a lot more than a lot of people consider.
Yeah.
Um, Apple, for example, where was it? Apple and Google are no longer allowing their payment sources for
Yes.
transit
Swift is
systems.
out too. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, maybe this is going to hurt Putin or some sort of Russian KGB officer or whatever. But who is it more likely to hurt? It's the people that don't have power in
Yeah.
a lot of instances, right? It's the Russian bakers who just have their small business and now can't get on the train anymore because they can't pay for it.
Yeah. And
Or
the Russian
God,
coin has been completely devalued.
yeah,
Their money is valueless, which means the only money that has value in the country is essentially ours. You know, other currencies.
yeah. Um,
And to that
God,
end, the people higher up in Russia, and this is the problem with Russian communism and Chinese communism as it is unlike what you think of in traditional communist and socialist ideals. It's really just same way the Nazis were claiming being socialist. It's just a title at this point. It's a name that they have given themselves. It is not the equitable distribution that Marx and Engels, demanded. It is not, you know, even as it's not even what like Lenin was portraying. This is a whole new level of stepping away. It's capitalism under another name with massive amounts of dictatorship.
for sure. And like I mentioned earlier, these these terms get bandied around a lot and can get muddied pretty quick. But so by no means am I an expert on governments across the world. That kind of goes without saying. But most governments are some form, including ours, are some form of blended government.
Mhm.
Right? The American government is not a pure democracy. It's not a pure constitutional republic.
No.
It's not. Um, even though you'll hear the term free market thrown around a lot, we do not have a purely free market. We have uh,
Regulations.
many regulations, sure, many elements within the government that you can consider socialist programs. Um, so, I mean, I don't even know how important some of these terms are, but one thing that often gets lost on people, in my experience, is language is a very um, it's an ever evolving and oftentimes blurry filter that I, as a person, am trying to use to convey my thoughts to you
Mhm.
as a person. And by no means is it perfect, but it seems to be the best method that we have at this time. Um, and my I consider myself politically, obviously part of the left. I already said that. Um, like relatively liberal, right? Pretty
Yeah.
liberal on certain things. Kind of depends on what the issue is. But the definition of like a classical liberal, for example, these definitions were created decades ago, right? If
Yeah.
not longer, depending on the area that you're talking about. Um, and they don't necessarily have the exact same connotations today as they did back then. So it can be hard to uh, to convey that to somebody, and that's why you often need to sort of define your terms as you're talking about whatever you're talking about.
Yeah, and that's why people often get confused with liberal and like liberalism. Like a liberalist is,
Capital L liberal versus lowercase
yeah,
l
you're
liberal.
looking at
Yeah.
someone who's more libertarian at that point.
Yeah. And the Liberal Party, like Canada, for example, actually has a Liberal Party. It's called something with liberal in the name. I don't remember exactly what it is. Um, but we don't, in America, we don't have a capital L Liberal Party. We have basically the Democratic Party, which would,
which globally is closer to center than anything.
yeah. And in our system, is it really, because we only have two main parties that most Americans have any idea of, um, or could even vote on in certain instances, that would be the more lowercase L liberal party out of the two.
Yeah.
Um, so that's another thing to consider as well. Something else you brought up, how this affects other areas. I brought up Nintendo, stuff like that. Did you hear what happened to RT,
RT? No.
Russia Today, the news organization?
Oh.
So Russia Today, at least the American branches, completely shut down. They shut down, told all their employees, basically over email, and out of the blue, with no real description as to why. Um, do you know who Lee Camp is?
The, the name sounds familiar.
So he's a comedian, um, but as a lot of comedians today uh, seem to function, is working essentially as like a quasi journalist, right? Kind of like
Yeah.
the Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and now his new thing, I forget what it's called, but he worked for RT America, and Abby Martin also worked for RT America. I don't know if she still did when it shut down. Excuse me, but she had a channel or a show there. Former Governor Jesse Ventura
Mm-hmm.
had a show on RT. A lot of people, and a lot of them were, again, using American terminologies, relatively left leaning, right? They're pretty liberal.
Yeah.
Lee Camp is basically a socialist. Abby Martin is hardcore left, um, but they were shut down. And Lee Camp is the only one that I know of that actively was working there when it happened. And he said he basically got no reason as to why they shut their doors or anything like that. He got no warning. His show was also, he has his own, it was called Redacted Tonight. He has his own, a couple podcasts he does. One is called Moment of Clarity. Moment of Clarity was deleted off of Spotify last week as well. And that was not associated with Redacted Tonight.
Yeah.
And then a bunch of his, I think it's all his Redacted Tonight YouTube stuff is banned across Europe and the UK. So effectively, he lost like the vast majority of his revenue sources over
Yeah.
the period of like a week. And this is a dude in America who by no means is like Putin's buddy or anything like that. But this is how these kind of punishments, these sort of collective punishments, can affect
Yeah.
everyday Americans.
So, and here's one that's not American, but the person I've dealt with in the music industry.
Mm.
It is Myasnikov Custom. They make amplifiers and preamps for guitar.
Mm.
Said if Facebook will be blocked in Russia, you can easy to contact me by these few ways: email address, or WhatsApp/Telegram, and the number.
Okay.
Someone responded, I was going to purchase a preamp from you, but due to your leader's actions, I will not be anymore. It's nothing personal to you, but I won't give any Russian a cent until your military leaves Ukraine. And his response was kind of like what any one of us would do. Like, okay, I'll call Putin right now to say, dude, you forgot to ask me before you do something.
I don't know if you shared this with me before, or if I saw this on like a YouTube news show, but I saw that exchange.
I might have shared it with you before, like one of the things. I might have even put it in the last one as a catch up for that. But like, so what's happening is people are over there protesting. Other people are just trying to go about their business, like
Mhm.
because yes, Russia has had revolutions before,
Mhm.
and obviously their army isn't doing spectacularly. And a lot of people are asking, like, oh, like for example, we're giving Poland money, or we're giving Poland stuff to give to Ukraine, because if we get involved directly, it has global implications. But we can get involved by giving their allies something and passing it through. Weird, dumb, I know, but that's how the rules of engagement go. But the vast majority of people over there just want to live their lives. Ukraine, Russia, they just want to be people. People are people. And holding people hostage when they can't, like, they don't have guns. Russia doesn't have guns. And for what it's worth, that's one of those things where I was talking. The fathers of communism, Marx and Engels, wrote that fact. And this is a quote that is almost always falsely attributed to Reagan, which is ironic to say the least.
Yeah.
And it is said in an 1850 speech entitled Address of the Central Committee to the Communist League. It was written by Marx and Engels. Under no pretext should arms and ammunition be surrendered. Any attempt to disarm the workers must be frustrated by force if necessary. And the reason why they saw that as a need, same reason why our forefathers saw it as a need, because you get people like Putin who get all the power, and like, no guns for anyone but people I trust.
Sure.
So it makes a rebellion much harder. Like,
yeah,
like a pipe rifle or a Ludi SMG that you just crafted in your garage is not going to be even half as reliable as the shittiest AK left over from the 60s. So even something outdated, still something you can use to protect yourself and to force that government, even if they're much bigger than you, to try to maybe reconsider.
Sure. Another guy that that's just a small business owner, as far as I know, in the like retro gaming community, goes by the name of Krix. It's
Okay.
Krikzz.
Yeah.
He created the EverDrives. So the EverDrive 64, the Mega Drive, the FX Pack Pro, and these are devices to allow you to plug SD cards into various consoles. So the 64 is obviously for the Nintendo 64. He has one for the GBA, things like that. I follow him on Twitter, and he's giving updates every now and then about himself and his family, and basically just like, hey, like, he's apologized several times that some of his shipments are being delayed. And a lot of the people who follow him are like, bro, be safe.
Yeah.
I can deal without my fucking EverDrive. And that's the thing. Like, most people involved have nothing to do. They're not really involved. Involved was a bad word. Most people that
Are caught up in this.
are caught up in this, are exactly that. They're caught up in it. They're not parts of the government and not part of the armies and things like that. And even if they're sympathetic to it, they're citizens, right? They're you and I. They're individuals who are trying to live their life. So yeah, it's crazy. And I like, I'm kind of surprised, but kind of not, at just how much a lot of the mainstream / corporate media is calling for no-fly zones, for example. I don't think a lot of people, even the people on the news, really understand what that means. So maybe we should cover that a little bit.
Yeah. Got a little bit of time.
Excuse me. So essentially, a no-fly zone, the concept is restricting flight around a specific area for specific people or population, right? So oftentimes, let's say I were ruling America, I would not implement a no-fly zone in my own country. Oftentimes, it would be in a completely different country somewhere else.
Yeah.
And
The last
in this,
no-fly we had was 9/11.
right? Yeah, and even then, that was for specific areas in our country, and was placed upon generally the populace.
Yeah.
But the military and associated elements still are able to fly. So when we're implementing something like this on another country, for example, like a lot of people in our political spheres are calling for, we would be saying essentially that you're hearing a lot about it being called for against Russians, right? Against the Russian government. So we would say there's a no-fly zone over area X, and very likely the Russian government or anybody associated with them could not fly into area X. If you do, you're getting shot down.
Yeah, it's an act of aggression to fly in.
Correct. And that last bit there is what seems to be lost on a lot of people. It's not just like you're putting a fucking stoplight in the air and then that's it. If they jaywalk, right? If they just cross in, we're just like, oh, naughty boy. No, you're gonna shoot them down. And if we implement that and we or our allies or somebody like that shoots down a Russian warplane in war.
Same as if we supplied warplanes to Ukraine directly ourselves. It's bringing us involved.
It's an act of war. Yeah, and I can't...
And Ukraine can't put the no-fly zone in place against Russia for their own skies because clearly Russia doesn't acknowledge the sovereignty of Ukraine to do that.
Yeah, I mean, and even if they did, I don't really know what good that would be to your opponent in war, right? the war's already at your doorsteps.
Yeah.
So it seems like that's something that you would do before that. But I've even seen, I think it was Representative Adam Schiff, I think is who it was in our government, was calling for a no-fly zone over there and stated, I'm not going to quote it because I don't remember it exactly, I don't think. But part of the quote was, we need to help fight Russia over there so we don't have to fight Russia here. When, as far as I know, there's no reason at this time to think Russia's coming for the US. And I mean, you're basically at that point admitting to a proxy war,
Well, Russia
like
has
on public
postured.
television.
Russia has postured in a way that has suggested that they would engage in war with the U.S.
They have stated that, as far as I understand it, anybody essentially helping Ukraine is going to face a wrath unlike they've ever seen, or something like that.
Well,
Is that what you're referring to?
no, they have declared, and the reason why that they're doing this, this is what goes back to, is that not just the separatists, but Ukraine joining NATO is a threat to Russia's national security. Russia
Right.
sees NATO as a threat to their national security.
Right.
We are part of NATO.
Correct.
So they have suggested that they are going to try to reclaim all of their resources. We're seeing that. That's what this is them trying to reclaim what they see as their resource. And again, going down into Moldova to take that after Ukraine. They have allied so aggressively with Belarus that it might as well be the reforming of the USSR. Putin is directly pulling strings in Belarus. And where else was it? Another country over there that was getting teamed up. I think it was Kazakhstan.
Mm.
These are moves that Russia has been making and then posturing against the US. They have done flyovers in parts of our areas. In Alaska, they have gone after, which, by the way, Alaska used to be Russian. When Russia is starting to take everything back, guess what?
So you're saying that Russian warplanes have flown over Alaska? Is that what I just heard?
They have buzzed the borders of our water, yes. And since Crimea, yes.
So they've come around those areas.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I hadn't heard that, so I was trying to parse out whether or not they flew directly, like there was warplanes flying directly over.
Back in 2020, Russian bombers
cities,
intercepted 8 miles from U.S. airspace.
So 8 miles, yeah, which is really close. 8 miles sounds.
Yeah, our
like kind of
airspace,
far, right?
our
No.
airspace extends so it was 28 miles off the coast, which, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, that was 2 years ago. That's obviously a very, at best, ballsy move. At worst, a direct threat.
It was a test. It was a test to our response to see if they could provoke an attack. It's the whole
Yeah.
I'm not touching you maneuver.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, mind you, he's also said that he has activated his country's nuclear deterrent system, which means they've armed the nukes. They're ready for nuclear war should NATO or any country in NATO become involved, which is a threat to the globe, period.
Yeah, nuclear war for sure. Yeah, my understanding is, and again, it's hard to parse out like what parts of any of this are simple political posturing, are direct actions implemented to essentially call a bluff. What part of it's just propaganda. And so by no means am I saying that anything I've said is the law of the land. But
some more information. 2019, the U.S. Canadian Airspace Defense Agency said 2 Russian bombers accompanied by 2 Su-35 fighter jets entered Alaskan air defense space. That was May of 2019. February 16th, obviously there's stuff going on, but Russian aircraft buzzes U.S. Navy patrol planes get within 5 feet.
And you said the
That was this year.
The DoD said that? Is
Yeah.
that what you said? Okay. Yeah, it's hard, man. Like, I had heard about some of the more recent stories, but I hadn't looked into them.
March 31st, Russian military is spending hours in the airspace near Alaska when it performs flyovers in the region.
The hard part when trying to parse all this out, especially when it's coming from our DoD, is they're always saying that we're on the brink of nuclear war with Russia. Always.
Well,
I mean, they let us into Afghanistan and Iraq because Saddam supposedly had weapons of mass destruction. That
wasn't the DoD.
that
was the CIA.
Right, but they worked together with generals in the government. You had that one guy, the 4-star general, who was on the floor of Congress with the little vial of, I think it was plutonium at the time. Colin Powell.
2018, 2 U.S. fighter jets were called to escort 2 Russian bombers away from international airspace.
Yes. So my point is not to say that whatever you're saying is bullshit, because by no means that's not what I'm saying. My point is just in general, as this stuff is happening, it's really hard to tell where the line between propaganda and truth is. And it's probably, a lot of this is probably a mix of both to some degree. Like, let's say that 5-foot example you gave. You said that was a Russian jet came within 5 feet of what? What was it?
Let me go back.
One of our jets.
Within 5 feet of a U.S. Navy plane.
Of a U.S. Navy plane. So let's take that example. So if that happened, right? If that's true, and again, I have no idea whether it is or not. I'm not saying that you're lying or that report's bullshit. But if that were true, I find it hard to believe that we didn't take it down.
Because if we did, it would become all-out open war.
Right, and I understand
and that's
that
what
part.
Russia's doing, and we have intel saying that they do it. This year was just another year. Like, Russia keeps poking our airspace. Same way, and this is one of those things, having done IT security, and InfoSec stuff, and our government is always hacking other governments, and vice versa.
Sure.
It's not a win-lose, it's just a constant, it's like a boxing match.
Yeah.
Our airspace is treated the same way as our cyberspace, in that they're always testing us.
Sure, as I'm sure we're always testing them, and not just them.
Well, the last time we did a test, because the one thing that Russia has on us is they have more nukes than we do.
Yeah.
Because as part of NATO, we expect that other NATO nations to have additional support armaments. So we toned down what we had.
Yeah. Both countries have over 5,000.
Russia has over 6, almost 7.
Yeah.
But due to the borders near Alaska, they can just keep popping over and being like, haha, I'm not touching you. The last time that we kind of pushed them, because we don't want to. we don't want to. Because if we go after them, we go after China, and it's a whole debacle. But what winds up happening is, during Syria in 2017, Russia claimed that we had violated their airspace, which I don't have, I can't really speak on the validity of that. It's quite possible, quite probable. But October 6, 2015, Russia invaded Turkish airspace. 2017, Russia and China violated South Korean airspace. Like, it's part of Russia's standard playbook to just start poking airspaces.
Sure.
Like, all you
And
have to do is type in U.S. warplanes test airspace and then pick a year. 2011. Nope, I got the 2014 one where they were intercepted off of Alaska and California. 2011 was a calm year for that. But 2010 they did a bunch of it.
yeah, I'm sure they are. Basically the point I was making is our government lies to us all the time. And people within our government, like the average salary, for example, of a senator or a congressperson is somewhere, last time I looked, somewhere around $120,000 a year,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. But a lot of them, Nancy Pelosi, for example, is over 100 millionaire,
Yeah.
right? A lot of them, she's one that's talked about a lot in the news. That's why I brought her up as the Speaker of the House. And she's been in Congress forever, right? She's the Speaker of the House. She's 100 years old. It doesn't matter how long she's been in there. You don't make $100 million, over $100 million off of $100,000 salary.
Not directly. And that's one of those things that it seems unsavory. But they also have business ventures. They also have book deals.
Sure.
When someone writes a book about her, she doesn't write the book.
Right.
She gets paid by these publishing companies a shit ton of money, and then she goes on to do promotional stuff. And that's
Sure,
the
they
thing
get
is,
speaking gigs.
politicians get paid a crap ton for those. They go to universities. They go on tours just like rock stars.
Mm-hmm.
Putting
No,
any of
they'll
that
get
into, financial stuff, when you have more than the bare minimum, it's easy to make a train out of that.
Oh, sure. It's also easy when you have those connections to trade stocks with information you're not supposed to have.
Mm-hmm.
It's also easy to argue for something like a no-fly zone when you're invested in the companies that are going to go implement that zone.
Yeah.
So that's something to consider. Is that the U.S. by far outspends every other country on our defense budget.
Hmm?
By far, it's like 12 times
Yeah.
the
And
next
as I
country.
mentioned in our last video, that's mandated by international law.
Well, I'm sure some of it you could say is, but like it's not mandated by international law for us to invade Iraq, for
No.
example, or for like Senator X to argue for that as like we got to get them so they don't get us, when really Senator X has nobody that's losing anything when
Yeah.
they do that, right? His son's not going to war,
Oh, absolutely.
right? And that's how it always is. It's not just the U.S. It's, Putin's son's not going to war. Sure, Putin was a KGB officer and whatever, but he's
Princess
not going.
Diana's son did.
Yeah, um, that seems like we could do a whole podcast episode on all the stuff involved with the royal family for sure. But most of the time, these people in power are making wars, and the people without power are fighting the wars, right? And there's a reason that like no bid contracts contracts exist. And there's a reason that, like, during the Bush years, Halliburton made a shitload of money. And who was the head of Halliburton? Just so happened to be Dick Cheney,
Yep.
who was vice president, right? So, like, it's really hard for me to in the moment, like in the moment of whatever war. And I have like I have friends, and I have very close friends and even people I consider family who have fought in many of the wars that the US has been involved in over the last 30 years.
Mhm.
Um, this is not by any means to say that I don't have any respect or anything like that for the soldiers doing the jobs, because that's not what I'm saying. I'm going to be as clear as I possibly can about that. However, the soldiers doing the jobs are not the people declaring the wars,
Right.
right? They're not the ones who are a lot of times doing anything but following or anything else other than follow orders. And just like, you at your last job or me at my last job often didn't agree with our boss. A lot of times that's what happens in war, right? The difference in war is that it's primarily about loss of life, right? That's kind of the whole point of war. And those ships that people are using and those guns that people are using are made by some company, right? And let's say we could stop all war tomorrow, right? Those companies aren't selling those tanks anymore, or at least not in the numbers that they're selling now, right? Those companies aren't selling those weapons in the same quantities that they are.
Yeah.
And that's something that we can't get away from, right? We can't, in conversation, we can't not include
Absolutely.
that aspect. So yeah, that's something I definitely worry about. Like, look, man, I'm against most war in most situations most of the time. Like,
Same.
I definitely think it should be the absolute last result, because there is never been and never will be a war where innocent bystanders don't die.
Yeah.
Most of the loss of life is innocent people on both sides of any
Absolutely.
war. And that's what I worry about. So yeah, like it's crazy. It's crazy. I don't I don't want this to continue. Um, there's good arguments and bad arguments on many sides on probably all sides or most sides of most situations. So what I try to do is do as much research as I reasonably can in a reasonable amount of time from reasonable sources and go from there. But especially in like an active war, like the hindsight we have now about the Iraq war, we didn't have when it was happening.
Yeah.
And that took years and years of FOIA requests and um, leaked emails and documents and all kinds of shit like that. There's the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in this current situation, that, you have to, I can't see it not being involved in this skirmish. There's liquid natural gas that the U.S. is an exporter of, that there's no reason to think they don't want to export more of that.
Yeah.
And the Nord Stream 2 pipeline would prevent some of their market share because it goes directly through that area. And it would allow Russia to send Germany oil, like directly, essentially. There were sanctions on the pipeline, then they were lifted, then they were sort of quasi lifted. There's just so much. There's
Yeah.
so much to look into.
Absolutely. And things are just going to keep evolving in this. So I think this will be the last one for a while.
Yeah.
Unless, like, there's a clean wrap up tomorrow and, like, something drastic changes. If Putin has a stroke and is dragged out, then, you know. But for now, there's just a limit on what kind of information is available, and the people involved. One thing I do want to talk, I think, next week was something AJ touched on, and something that I kind of want to deal with. And it's actually one of our points that we have somewhere in our notes. The boundaries between, like, coincidence and conspiracy.
Sure.
And the amount of stuff that just kind of happens. Because there are a lot of people that are skeptic, and then there are people who take that to the next step and become contrarian. And AJ does a really good job of staying this side of that. But I have some friends that are like, oh, if they tell you this, it's wrong. They're lying. And it's like, that's the easiest way of being manipulated. But like, no, don't jump off that bridge. Okay, I'm going to jump off that bridge. Cool. Well, there's one person I'll have to deal with.
Yeah, it's really hard to I should say it's really easy is what I meant to say. It's really easy to go down the rabbit hole of, like, government X said A, so that means inherently it must be B.
Yeah.
It's very easy to go down that road. And frankly, it's like everybody has a lack of bandwidth, right? There's only so many hours in the day. There's only so many news outlets or like Substacks you can follow. And and yeah, it's I've certainly seen that, done that. Yeah, like
and like,
yeah.
And to that end, I'm even one of the primary source for my news is Al Jazeera. A lot of people think that that's crazy, that I looked for Al Jazeera as a source before, like, CNN or Fox or whoever. But they are one of the most reputable that you'll ever find.
Yeah, yeah, the name alone scares a lot of people.
Yeah.
But yeah, just like you know, in the music industry, company like whatever Harbinger, like we were talking about, or Shure or whatever, they may have a great reputation and they may make great products, but nobody makes everything perfectly.
Yeah.
And that's probably the easiest example to see that is like the New York Times as a whole, regardless of what you think of their politics, may have a lot of people on their staff that do good reporting, but they also have a lot of people on their staff that are pure ideologues.
Yeah.
And same is true with, you know, Breitbart or you know, whatever the polar opposite would be. So consider those friends.
Yeah, absolutely. So for now, I think that's a pretty good cover. If you guys have any suggestions, let us know. Reach out, emails, socials. We're always around. Someone can answer your question. You can even whisper here on Twitch. I check it on the regular. So
For sure. Be nice to people. Be nice to everybody, whether you agree or disagree.
And
Don't be a douche.
don't be a douche, and stay safe out there. Take it easy.